in the last lesson, we decided we're going to stick with something like the Cartesian project. In other words, that model of knowledge that René Descartes initiated, we're going to try to explore that a little bit further because there's lots of appealing components to it. First and foremost, the JTB theory of knowledge, that's been very intuitive to a lot of people for literally millennia. There's also the foundationalism, which means there's a method for blocking skeptical argumentation. And then there's the rationalism. Rationalism is a view that knowledge is rooted in reason. And once you develop your model of the world, you can have guaranteed certainty in your beliefs. So rationalism, because it guarantees certainty, very appealing. Now, there is a problem that we face if we decided to, continue with the Cartesian project or something like it, right? Something that has sort of the flavor of Descartes. And that is that, well, if we're taking Descartes as a model, we need to start from the foundational beliefs and take them all the way to our beliefs about the world itself. In other words, sort of the big issue for Descartes is that, yeah, sure, let's assume that he establishes his 4 foundational beliefs. Remember, there are 4 of them. And let's say now that you want to work your way to defending everything else that you know. How are you going to go from those 4 beliefs to defending the view that what my eyes see actually matches the world itself, and I am currently not in a dream, and whatever else you want to, all your other everyday beliefs? How are you going to get there? It's a little bit, here's a weird metaphor, or is it a simile? I don't know. But it's a little bit like if you're trying to build a skyscraper, and a skyscraper is the typical, visual version that I give of Descartes' philosophy. But you're trying to build a skyscraper, and they tell you, okay, here you go. Here's a hammer. Here is an Allen wrench. Here is a spoon and a compass. Go. How are you going to build a skyscraper from those 4 things? That's sort of the situation that Descartes is in. How are you going to go from your beliefs about the world from just your foundational beliefs that you established? Well, that's when Descartes brings in God. Remember that it is in an attempt to bridge the gap between his core foundational beliefs and knowledge of the world as we know it, that Descartes invokes God's existence. Since God is benevolent, God would not let you be deceived about what you think you are seeing, right? That's the way that Descartes vindicates our everyday beliefs. He says, hey, we know God exists, and we know he's all good, and we know that means he wouldn't let us think, for example, that we're currently in a dream when we're actually, or think we're actually in the real world when we're currently in a dream. We wouldn't be deceived in that way. God wouldn't let that happen. And he certainly wouldn't let an evil demon be deceiving us through some weird artifice, right? So that is Descartes' basic, the necessity of God in Descartes' basic project. Okay, well, here is an issue that arises. Descartes' argument for God's existence, his ontological argument, we talked about this before, not typically considered very persuasive. And so this doesn't mean, we should say, that the Cartesian project is untenable, or at least if we're being sticklers, like, maybe Descartes' project isn't going to work, but something like Descartes' project could work, I guess. So what we need to do then is to search for more adequate arguments for God's existence. Okay, so what do we do? Well, the Catholic Church has a rich history of apologetics. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a bunch of reasoned defenses and explanations of the Catholic faith. So you can go to those, and they're from, late antiquity, even from the Roman Empire. They're from the Middle Ages, right? There's a lot to choose from there. And if you're going to go there, well, you kind of have, sort of a shining star that you can, probably naturally gravitate toward. His name is Thomas Aquinas, and he famously provided his 5 ways. These are 5 arguments for proving God's existence through reason and evidence. Now, quick shout out to all the philosophers that came before Aquinas, because Aquinas even admits this, right? He basically took a bunch of ideas from earlier philosophers and just kind of put them together. So there's a bunch of Muslim philosophers and other Latin thinkers that Aquinas borrows from. But in any case, hey, why don't we do that? Why don't we just grab a couple of Aquinas's arguments, establish God's existence, and presto pasta, we got ourselves, a rationalist, foundationalist project that works, inspired by Descartes. Well, the problem is that, okay, sure, Aquinas was still super influential in this time period. Now we are in the, let's just say, 1700s. Especially, by the way, after the Reformation, Aquinas, the Catholic Church sort of doubled down on Aquinas after the Reformation. So if you don't know about the Reformation, take a philosophy of religion course. I definitely cover it in mine. So anyway, Aquinas was influential, but a lot of thinkers in this time period, which, by the way, is sometimes called the Age of Enlightenment, they began to have religious doubts in this time period, and they began to speak out against certain religious doctrines and, certain religious explanations. So that's going to be sort of the situation that we're in right now. We're going to explore, maybe an argument for God's existence, but now there's a whole lot more pushback than there used to be a couple of centuries earlier. So to really establish God's existence, we're going to have to sort of overcome those objections as well. So as I said, this period is known as the Age of Enlightenment, and it is a time period when many with the courage to reason began to dismantle the pillars of religious authority. And so I want to give you sort of a sense of what this was like. So let's begin with a little bit of food for thought, and hopefully it'll give you a feel for what I'm talking about. I guess for this to work out, we have to first look at an argument for God's existence. I'm going to pick one of Aquinas' arguments, and I'm going to pick his 5th way. It's typically known as the teleological argument, but sometimes people call it something like the intelligent design argument or argument from intelligent design, different versions of the name. They are the same argument family, right? There's different versions of it. And to be honest, I'm actually borrowing twice. This is basically Aquinas' argument, but I'm going to give you the version of someone named Paley, just because I think it's easier to understand. So yeah, a lot of borrowing here, but it's okay. We just need an argument for God's existence so that we can see the sort of critiques that get launched at it during this time period. Okay, so the teleological argument, here we go. Premise 1, the world displays order, function, and design. Okay, yeah, it sort of seems like the world has some kind of function, namely to, provide a space for us to live. It seems like our planet is just at the right place away from the sun so that it's not too cold, it's not too hot, and we get a nice night and day cycle, which lines up with our circadian rhythm so that we can rest sometimes. Okay, yeah, it looks like it fits us pretty well. So the world does display order, function, and design. There's other things that display order, function, and design. For example, maybe watches are like this. If you were to be walking down the beach and you were to see a watch in the sand, you wouldn't say to yourself something like, oh man, this just happened, right? Like it was just like lightning and waves crashing on sand and it made this watch. No, it seems to be, having a specific function and it has a design, right? So all that sort of suggests that things that are, displaying order, function, and design, like watches, they do so because they were created by an intelligent designer, right? It isn't, again, just random waves and lightning crashing that make a watch. A watch had to be designed and it had to be, assembled in the right way for it to fulfill its function, which is to tell time. And so, sure, things that display order, function, and design, they seem to have had some kind of creator. Okay, well, therefore, the world displays order, function, and design because it was created by an intelligent designer or creator. And of course, we know this as God. So this has been an incredibly influential argument throughout the history of basically philosophy everywhere. You see these kind of arguments crop up, Western philosophy, Muslim philosophy. I've seen something like this in Asian philosophy, Indian philosophy in particular. So anyway, very, very popular argument. But like I said, the point of this lesson today, at least, is that we are seeing that many thinkers from the Age of Enlightenment are now pushing back. And so I will give you the example of David Hume. David Hume is not quite an atheist. He would at least say he's not an atheist. He would probably call himself just a skeptic, He says, I don't have beliefs about this. Maybe you might want to call him an agnostic. He might say, well, I don't know that we can know whether or not God exists. Okay, if you want to call him that. Even he was pretty careful about his comments, though. He actually didn't publish his dialogues concerning natural religion until after his death, even though by the end of his lesson, we will meet some real atheists. A lot of them, waited until they died to make their views known because, well, it wasn't necessarily safe for them yet. Maybe not necessarily for their safety, but their professional lives, they might not get jobs and all that because they are non-believers. In any case, in this work, Hume critiques the teleological argument, and a lot of these objections are basically now considered standard objections to almost any argument from the intelligent design family of arguments. So I'm going to begin. Really, there's no order to these. I just kind of picked a few of my favorites. But maybe I can say that I'm starting with simpler ones, and then I'm going to build up to more complicated ones. But let's begin with the regress problem, which is kind of an obnoxious problem that Hume presents. But here's what Hume says. Okay, if complexity implies that there is a designer, then consider how complex God must be. It seems like God, since he is so complex, also had a designer. So the question is, who is this meta God, this creator of gods? The basic idea here is that people who are putting forward the intelligent design argument, what they're really saying is like, look at the world, look at the planet, look at the universe. It looks like it was designed for us. It has order, it has a function. So that must mean that there is a creator, right, which we call God. Well, what Hume is saying is that, okay, well, you're looking at the universe. Now I'm thinking about God. This being looks like it was designed because it literally has a function. It creates universes. That must be, its own sort of orderly design. There must be someone that made that being that can literally make universes. It's so complex. It wouldn't just happen, right? It wouldn't, there must be an explanation for it. And so he says, maybe there's another God that created this God that created the universe. Yeah, so that's sort of annoying. It's not like a knockdown argument, but what Hume is trying to do here is create skeptical doubt. He's trying to say, well, how do you know that the book stops with Yahweh, right? How do you know there's not a God above that God? And this kind of, skeptical objection, it really begins to undermine like how much you know about the supernatural. All right, let's look at another argument from Hume. I call this one the problem of compatibility with polytheism. Basically, what Hume is saying is that if you were to take the intelligent design argument and just assume that it's sound, or let's pretend it's sound, that does not necessarily prove the existence of a singular God. It's possible that many gods collaborated to create the universe. So again, if we're thinking about the universe, there's a lot of parts to it. There's, stars, there's planets, there's black holes, there's assemblies of stars, right? Constellations and galaxies and all that. So, okay, there's a lot going on there. What do we know about human-made artifacts that are very complex? Well, one thing that we know about something like, maybe a skyscraper or a computer or something else, there's not one creator. There's actually quite a few different people that collaborated to bring about, for example, a skyscraper. And so the universe is pretty complicated. Doesn't it make more sense that a lot of gods kind of collaborated to make the universe? Maybe one of them focused on stars and the other one on planets or whatever, right? And so now the question is, well, how do you know you got the right religion? It seems like a polytheistic religion is the more likely candidate. So there's another sort of obnoxious skeptical objection. If we're talking about obnoxious skeptical objections, here's my favorite. I love this one. The infant deity hypothesis. Even if we accept that the universe has a designer, we are only entitled to infer a cause proportional to the effect. Let me pause right there. What does that mean? Well, you have to look at the quality of the universe. And if it's like a perfect universe, then you're like, oh, it must have been a perfect creator. But if it isn't a perfect universe, then you would say, maybe it's a newbie, right? It's a guy that doesn't really know what they're doing yet. Well, what Hume is saying is that since the universe contains flaws, suffering, and botched designs, we cannot infer a perfect, omnipotent, or all-loving God. So I'm not exactly sure which flaws Hume was aware of, astronomically speaking, in the 1700s. But today we know a bunch of things about the universe. For example, it's really only, some parts of the universe, like at least our particular part of the galaxy, that are pretty stable. There's other parts of the universe that are kind of a mess. Like there's literally a bunch of galaxies crashing into each other. And so for any stars in those galaxies that might have planets on them, that maybe have life on them, well, it doesn't seem too orderly or stable, right? It looks like, you're alive, your evolution's happening, and then your galaxy crashes into another galaxy and it's gone. So that doesn't seem too coherent. That's crazy. And there's also black holes, which are literally eating up certain planetary systems and solar systems and all that. So that's another aspect that looks kind of chaotic. In some, it doesn't look like the universe is anywhere near perfect. So maybe this flawed world was actually made by an infant deity. In other words, given how chaotic actually the universe is, it's like a baby god that made the universe, not an actual adult, mature, competent god. So there's another incredibly obnoxious objection. I like it though. I mean, there's something, how do you know God is perfect? Based on the universe, which does contain suffering. It does contain sort of counterintuitive arrangements. How do you know that God is perfect? Right? So there it is. Okay, let's get into. I have two more objections, and these are a little headier. So make sure that shake your head. Make sure you're awake for this one. Here we go. This is called breaking the analogy. Whenever you are dealing with analogical arguments, you have to make sure that you know the two things that you are comparing. For example, if you're going to make an analogical argument about, let's just say you're trying out a new drug for heart medication. And you don't want to try it on humans yet, but pigs have hearts that are very similar to humans. So you're going to try it out on pigs first. So you do that, and then it turns out that it works. And so then you make an analogical argument. You say, okay, well, pig hearts are a lot like human hearts. It worked for pigs, so it will probably work for humans. Okay, that's an analogical argument. Notice you know the two things you're comparing, the pig hearts and the human hearts. Well, now what Hume is saying is like, this is an analogical argument. You're comparing something like a watch, which has a designer, to the world, which the claim is that it also has a designer. But Hume is saying, look, that analogy between human-made objects like a watch and the universe is incredibly weak. A watch is so not like the universe. I mean, for starters, they're very different in size. Like literally one fits inside the other many billions of times over, right? And so for that reason alone, it's pretty hard to take this analogy seriously, says Hume. Here's another item another reason for why we should think that watches are very unlike universes. Maybe you've seen a watch get made. That's a big maybe. I don't think you have, because I haven't, and so I don't think that people just go around watching watches get made. But let's just say that you have. You for sure haven't seen a universe, be formed. And so you're comparing something that maybe you know how it's been made to something that you for sure don't know how it was made or how it happened, right? There's theories about it, but there's also a lot of disagreement about that. So one more point that Hume makes, if you want to make a better analogy, the universe kind of resembles an organism. And he says a vegetable or animal. What he means by this is that the universe is growing, right? And it sort of self-regulates and it has laws that govern it. And, that's not like watches. That's more like a plant, right? That grows. So that is, Hume's suggestion. And if that's the case, well, plants, it's hard to say that they have a designer. I grow a bunch of plants, and I'll tell you, they kind of grow on their own. I mean, I don't even water them sometimes, and they just grow on their own. So, not exactly, a good example of something that needs an intelligent designer. So to sum up, this is an analogical argument, the argument from intelligent design, and it compares two things that are very not similar. And so it doesn't work. And in fact, if you want to compare the universe to something a little closer to it that we are familiar with, maybe some kind of living organism, the intuition about appealing to an intelligent designer kind of goes away. And so, yeah, that is Hume's objection there. Again, this is actually a pretty strong objection that you need to consider a little bit before you really see, the import of it. And why would that be a good analogy, right? So anyway, that is one of Hume's stronger objections. I'll give you one more only because I like it so much, or I like the effect that it had on people in the future. So I'm calling this the Epicurean hypothesis. And at some point, Hume considers this, which is way ahead of its time. But here's what he is saying. If matter is finite, but time is infinite, particles in constant motion will eventually cycle through every possible arrangement. once a stable, ordered arrangement occurs, like our universe, it will persist simply because it is stable. And this will create the appearance of design without requiring a designer. Okay, so let me go through that first bit. If you just, imagine a lot of time passing through, a lot of interesting things can happen once you consider, billions of years, right? Or, even trillions of years, right? Even more than that, especially if you go into infinity. For example, the very common example of this is if you grab, a bunch of monkeys and have them type randomly on typewriters for infinity, eventually, even if it takes a really long time, they will, through their random typing, produce one of Shakespeare's plays. And so all you have to do is give it enough time. But randomness will eventually produce something that is, at least appears to be, non-random. And so this stable, ordered arrangement, that is what Hume says maybe happened to our universe. Maybe there's a bunch of atoms crashing into each other for a really long time, but eventually something like planets formed and they started floating in, floating isn't the right word, but they arranged themselves into something like solar systems and galaxies and all that. And simply over time, what we got is, at least in our neck of the woods, something like a nice solar system that looks like it was designed for us, but it's only the appearance of design. In reality, it was just, random collisions of atoms that eventually, over a long period of time, created this stable, ordered arrangement. So that's, to be honest, the view, something like the view of some physicists today. And the reason why I really mentioned it, though, is because apparently these passages from Hume's work inspired, about a century later, a man named Charles Darwin. So that's kind of interesting, right? And maybe you can kind of see the parallels there. I will leave that part up to you to check out the similarity between Darwinian reasoning and this view that I'm calling the Epicurean hypothesis from Hume. Okay, so we've seen that in the 1700s, now we have people that are more willing to argue against, common arguments for God's existence. Now, it's always been the case that people have been people have been producing arguments for God's existence, and other people have been critiquing them. But usually those other people are still believers. And what we see in Hume is someone who is committed to skepticism. And so that's new. Speaking of new, there's another orientation toward God that crops up in the Age of Enlightenment. And I want to talk about that one next in our story time. So we talked about Hume, who is a religious skeptic. There's another flavor of skeptic that comes around. Not necessarily a skeptic, I suppose, but a different view of what God is. So one of the more influential and far-reaching ideas during the Enlightenment was Deism. Deism is a view that there is a supernatural God who created the world, but who is not concerned with humans and does not intervene in earthly affairs. What does that mean? Basically, a bunch of these deists, or what it meant to be a deist, is that you believe God exists, but he made the world and then dipped, right? So he doesn't listen to your prayers, right? He's never going to answer your prayers, that's for sure. And he doesn't really care what you do. He's gone, right? God has abandoned you. And so, that's deism in a nutshell. Maybe I'm being a little histrionic, but that's roughly the view. And this was quite popular during this time period. It's even the case that Voltaire and his BFF, Frederick the Great of Prussia, were deists. Now, Voltaire is probably known to you. A lot of people read Voltaire's book Candide in high school. But he was a very influential French philosopher, and very interesting that one of his best friends was the king of Prussia, known as Frederick the Great. And it seemed to be the case that Enlightenment philosophy really had the effect on Frederick because he was one of these, they call them enlightened despots, basically, absolute monarchs that kind of force their societies to be less brutal, more progressive, maybe is a way to put it. I'll give you an example. Frederick was one of the kings or monarchs in general that started to basically cut back on public executions. So in these days, there was such a thing as a public execution. You would be executed for, I don't know, what seems to be, not really terrible offenses sometimes, including, blasphemy, especially in Spain, apparently. In any case, Frederick sort of made it tougher to have public executions. Now, he didn't get rid of them altogether. That sort of took a long time to happen. But that's sort of a step in the right direction because these public executions were sort of unimaginably brutal. I mean, it's essentially torture out in the town square, and then you watch someone get killed, and it's pretty ghastly to read about. So, in any case, a bunch of European enlighteners were deists, as were a group of elites who in 1776 fomented a revolt of the American colonies against Great Britain. Who am I talking about? Who are these elites that made a revolt happen against the UK or Great Britain? I'm speaking of none other than the American rebels, who would eventually come to be known as the Founding Fathers. Yes, my friends, the founders were a bunch of deists, and they were also committed to other ideas associated with deism, such as rational inquiry, an opposition to superstition, and the pursuit of happiness. So I will come back to the pursuit of happiness later. Let's talk about the opposition to superstition. Here pictured we have Ben Franklin, and it's his very famous experiments with his kites during a lightning storm. Why was he doing that? Oh, it's because he wanted to prove to people, provide evidence for people that storms are simply just, they're a natural phenomenon. It's just electricity, really. Because at the time, a lot of people still believed that storms were like, a message from God. God is upset, and that's why he's showing his wrath through this lightning storm. And there's even very famous people, like a man named Martin Luther, who initiated the Reformation, who saw a storm as a message from God. Like he was thinking about doing one thing, and then there was a lightning storm, and he said, oh, God doesn't want me to do that. And so Benjamin Franklin is trying to send a message to these people that is not true, right? So this is being very much opposed to superstition. I'll talk about one more of these founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson. He actually compiled a version of the New Testament that had no mention of miracles. That's because he thought that Jesus was not the Son of God, but just a great moral teacher. And so we definitely should know about him, but we should take out this superstitious stuff. And so that's why he published his particular version, or I guess he didn't publish it, but he kind of handed out his particular version of the Gospels, right? So, okay, so we have at least two types of non-religious people. We have the religious skeptic, like David Hume, and then we have these deists. Now, there is eventually, during the latter part of the Age of Enlightenment, the first real modern atheists. So we have to set the stage for them a little bit. Let's do that next. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're going to get to some real dyed-in-the-wool atheists at the end of this lesson. And that's because eventually in this course, we will cover some of the most hardcore arguments against God's existence, because that is, of course, something that we need to overcome if we're going to defend something like the Cartesian project. But what I want to do in what remains of this lesson is explain to you how slowly, it took time, but slowly, this anti-religious sentiment was able to be expressed. You had people like Hume, who literally would hide, their irreligiosity, so that they wouldn't get, setbacks in their professional lives. Eventually, you had people who were very boisterous atheists. So I kind of want to set that up for you a little bit. And the way I see it, at least, is that slowly religion lost its monopoly on explanation. In other words, for a long time, the answer to almost every question that mattered had to do in some way with religion. And eventually that went away. And that's what paved the way for some people to really kind of, in a very bombastic way, claim their atheism and, declare religion to be irrational and all that. I call this process, by the way, the Great Erosion, because it's not like it happened in one place at one time. It just kind of happened slowly, right? So everything that I'm going to say right now, it's just part of the story. There's literally no way I can tell you the whole story, but I'm going to give you just some important tidbits. Hopefully will get you to, understand a little more clearly what was going on in this time period. Step one, the return of naturalism. So naturalism, we've already been exposed to it a little bit, is this, rejection of supernatural explanations. It's basically the view that maybe the most important thing when explaining something is empirical observation or science. Some people go even further, and that's the only way to explain things, through science. So that would be naturalism. Its official title is methodological naturalism. But I want to tell you about this story, about how naturalism came back. Unfortunately, I got to teach you some words, so let's move into that. Here are some important concepts. Let's begin with eudaimonic ethics. So let's look at the root there. Eudaimonia, that is a Greek term that can be roughly translated as thriving or flourishing. Sometimes it's translated as happiness, but what the ancients meant by happiness is not what we mean by happiness. So thriving, I think, is a better explanation or translation. I typically translate it as that. And it just turns out that many of the moral systems of the ancient world, not all of them, but many of them, including that of Plato, Aristotle, the Pyrrhonians, the Stoics, the Pythagoreans, they were all aimed at eudaimonia, at this thriving. So put another way, they were eudaimonic ethical systems. Or I really like the way Julia Annas puts it. They were morality of happiness or moralities for thriving. And so that is the way it was in the ancient world. Not everyone, again, but most ethicists, most people that were thinking about what you should do, they were all trying to figure out those set of behaviors, those character traits, those situations that lead you to fare well, to flourish, to thrive. That's what being good was. Being good, obviously it entailed being kind to other people, but mostly because being kind to other people leads to profitable outcomes for everyone. And so morality was about success, basically, personal success, which included not necessarily money, although for some of these people like Aristotle, that was a part of it, but just, inner peace or some kind of different, everyone had their own conception of thriving. So whatever that philosopher's conception of thriving was, the good life or being good entailed working toward that. This is very different from another kind of moral discourse that was around, in the ancient world too. We typically call this divine command morality or divine command theory. And divine command theory is the view that the very meaning of moral is what God has commanded of creation. So let me just kind of juxtapose these real quick. For divine command theorists, moral is just whatever God told you to do, right? It doesn't have to do with personal success or thriving or happiness. You have to do it because God told you to do it. That's what morality means to them. For the eudaimonic people, you might even want to call it eudaimonic morality, they use the word moral, but it didn't mean, it's a rule imposed on you by God. They meant it as like, well, these are things that will get you to thrive. And so these are very different approaches to moral discourse. Even though they use the same words, like morality, they meant very different things by it. So maybe the most important thing that I can harp on right now is that contrary to many of the moral systems of the ancient world, if you're a divine command theorist, you're not moral because it helps you thrive in this life. You're moral because God told you to do it, and maybe that'll make you worthy of some kind of reward in the next life. And so there's a this lifeness versus an other lifeness going on here, right? Eudaimonic ethics is about understanding the world, that's part one, so that you can thrive in it. And divine command morality is following these commands from God so that you can, in the future, in the next life, maybe go to heaven, right? So very different approaches to morality. If I could kind of sum it up, in a nutshell here for you, eudaimonic ethics is about taking actions that will lead to flourishing, happiness, well-being, etc. in this life. Divine command morality is about obeying the commands of God so that one may attain salvation from eternal damnation. Very different approaches. Notice that if you want to be successful in this life, for like the eudaimonic ethicists, you have to know stuff. You have to understand how the natural world works, how cities work. You have to basically inquire into what today we would call science. We have to know how things work. In divine command morality, you don't really need to know that. And so they tend to not focus so much on scientific inquiry. Sometimes they even see it as completely irrelevant. And so these are very different approaches to morality. Well, I bet you that, you find one of these more intuitive than the other. I'm going to give you my 2-minute spiel on how that happened. In the ancient world, really, eudaimonic ethics was sort of the thing. Philosophy was more like a way of life. So if you were a Stoic, you would, adopt certain ways of acting and thinking, and that was so that you can thrive according to what the Stoics called thriving. And if you were a Pyrrhonian, you adopted certain ways of, behaving and thinking so that you can thrive in the way the Pyrrhonians, thought thriving was. And the same thing was for each school. It was every school of philosophy had their own approach to thriving. And basically, you just follow that way of life so that you can live the good life, or what they called the good life. During this time period, divine command theory was around. There was a religion, you've probably heard of it. It's called Judaism, and they were divine command theorists, and they've been around for forever, right? And it's a very old religion. Then there was a guy named Jesus, and that was an offshoot of Judaism, and it became something called Christianity. And it was actually a couple of centuries after Jesus died that a Roman emperor decided to make the whole Roman Empire Christian. And then slowly but surely, over several centuries, divine command theory was basically imposed on, the Romans, any territories that the Romans ruled over. And so it took a long time, and it took a little bit of violence, and they had to actually close down the schools of philosophy by force. But over time, divine command theory became the norm. What does that mean for us? Well, again, divine command theory doesn't necessarily involve personal success in this life. And so understanding how the world works doesn't really come into the picture. Some people, like Augustine, Saint Augustine, even thought that curiosity was a sin. So you not only do you not need to investigate the natural world, but it might even be like adjacent to sin. So totally different, right, than the eudaimonic ethicists. And why am I telling you all this? Well, remember earlier I mentioned the founding fathers, and I talked about the pursuit of happiness, and I even said, hey, I'll come back to this. Well, what many of the founding fathers meant by the pursuit of happiness is maybe best translated as the pursuit of thriving. So it turns out that a bunch of founding fathers loved eudaimonic ethics. So let me tell you the story as quickly as I can. And it has to do with a bunch of people named or dubbed humanists. And here we have pictured Poggio Bracciolini. I don't know if that's actually how you pronounce it, but I do think it's fun to pronounce Italian names, or try to at least. Anyway, Poggio was one of these humanists, and what they would do is they would go around hunting for old manuscripts that contained pieces of eudaimonic ethical works, right? So Poggio is very famous because he rediscovered a poem named De Rerum Natura, I guess in Latin, De Rerum Natura, or something like that. That was in 1417, and this is a poem written by a man named Lucretius that defended Epicurean philosophy. Now, Epicureanism is a philosophy for attaining sort of like an inner peace, and there's all sorts of practices, and it's a little anti-religion, and there's this whole thing, right? But the point here is that people like Poggio were going around and rediscovering all these ancient texts, and they were translating them, and they were, getting the ball rolling on distributing them. And it took centuries, but by the time that we get to the Age of Enlightenment, they were all the rage. Almost all the intellectuals from the Age of Enlightenment that we, know of were basically enraptured by these recently rediscovered and translated writings of ancient eudaimonic ethicists, as were the founding fathers. In fact, I talked about Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson because we have records of them engaging in practices that were aimed at cultivating self-mastery and character. In other words, I mentioned earlier that ancient philosophy was more like a way of life. You had to behave and think a certain way. So it wasn't just, like philosophers today that they just work at a university and that makes you a philosopher. You had to actually act and think in a certain way to count as a philosopher. And that's what Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were trying to do. And so the point of all this is that people were reading a bunch of ancient texts. And these ancient texts were about eudaimonic ethics, which emphasize that you have to understand how the world works so that you can succeed in it, right? So that you can thrive and flourish. And so the effect of all this was the eventual return of naturalism. Again, a move away from supernatural explanations toward natural ones. One very good example of this is that it was these enlighteners who were reading a bunch of eudaimonic ethics that were the first to recognize what today we see as mental illness, right? They recognized that it was a medical problem. Prior to this, there's all kinds of explanations about, mental illness. Typically, it had to do with demonic possession or witchcraft or something like that, not necessarily a medical explanation. But now the enlighteners were saying, yeah, I think this is a medical problem. So that is a bit of naturalism there. Okay, well, naturalism comes back. Bacon's views are becoming more popular. And so now there's a whole lot more interrogating of nature. So what does that mean exactly? My favorite example of this, I like to call it the deep time crisis, because it has to do with how old the Earth is. Now, if someone asked you, hey, how old is the Earth? Back in the day, what you would basically do is what James Usher did, is that he went to the Bible and he figured out what dates he knew, for the people in the Bible. And then he just, meticulously counted the ages of the generations, backward, everything listed in the Old Testament. And he made his way all the way back to Adam and Eve. And he's like, oh, okay, I figured out how old the Earth is. The Earth was made on October 23rd, 4004 BCE. That's his actual figure, by the way. And that's how you figured out how old the Earth is. Well, naturalism comes back and people are having different views about this. One person who had a very different view is Wilhelm Leibniz. And what he did is he studied fossils like shark's teeth and geological formations in caverns. I actually have a picture here of the Harz district in Germany. Looks pretty cool. And from this interrogation of nature, he eventually came up with this new hypothesis. He said, I think the Earth was originally molten and it cooled very slowly. And it also went through cycles of cooling and warming, right? Where it was contracting and expanding. And then it had occasional violent shifts. So this is long before modern tectonic plate theory. So now you know that there's a bunch of tectonic plates and they crash into each other. And that causes mountain ranges, right? The Himalayas were caused by two tectonic plates crashing into each other. So were the Andes in South America. None of that was known at the time, but you can see Leibniz as sort of stepping in that direction. He's just saying, I feel like there's a lot of iron in the planet Earth, and iron cools very slowly. There had been experiments by a guy named Leclerc that established that. So he's saying, I think the Earth is older than 6,000 years. Well, now people had some options, right? Eventually, there was a discovery of a whale actually on a hillside. And so what do you do with that information? People discovered a whale basically in a mountain. How does a whale get there? There's two stories, right? You can say, well, there was a flood, Noah's Ark, all of that. Or you can say, well, Leibniz has this theory where the Earth kind of has like these violent moments where one part of the Earth goes this way and another part of the Earth goes that way. And so things get moved around. Maybe that's how this fossil got moved around. Well, people began to do something that in prior decades and centuries for sure would have been unimaginable. They started going towards Leibniz's view, right? They were saying, I think that because of these fossils and the way the Earth looks, right? If you ever go see a fault line, you can see it looks like the Earth is like being torn in half. How does that happen? What happens very slowly, only a few centimeters per year, and you wouldn't be able to get that sort of a distance when you see, different fault lines shifting in just 6,000 years. It takes, at least tens of thousands of years. And so people were moving more toward Leibniz's view, where it just turns out that the Earth is way older than 6,000 years. And so more and more evidence accrued. And eventually, a lot of enlighteners shifted away from that 6,000-year-old view of Earth to a much older planet, even if they, didn't precisely want to give it an age yet. And so this is a move away from the authority of sacred texts, right? It's not that the Bible has the ultimate say, more so moving toward the retrodiction of nature. You have to go look at nature itself and try to predict what happened through nature itself, right? So that is definitely a major shift, thanks to the return of naturalism, moving toward a point where you really have to go look at nature to figure things out. That is a big, big difference, right? Don't go look at the Bible anymore. Go look at nature itself. Speaking of the Bible, we also see the rise of biblical criticism around this time period. Now, we can do this forever. I'm going to try to not do this forever. But I'll just give you a couple of samples of this. Basically, a couple of intellectuals felt that they were warranted in critiquing Scripture itself. Let me give you some examples here. One philosopher named Baruch Spinoza questioned the view that Moses wrote the Pentateuch being the first couple of books of the Bible. And what was Spinoza's argument? He basically pointed out that in the Pentateuch, we see Moses' death. And so you can't write how you died, right? Like that's not possible. You can speculate about how you're going to die, but that wouldn't work out in this case, right? It wouldn't be. Then you'd be calling the Bible speculation. Anyway, the point here is that Spinoza was thinking to himself, I don't think we should keep attributing authorship to these first 5 books of the Bible to Moses. That doesn't make sense. And that sort of questioning was not really allowed, previously. It didn't actually work out great for Spinoza, but like I said, some people that had some doubts about religion, ended up suffering some setbacks. Let's talk about Isaac Newton. You know him as a physicist, but he actually dabbled in a bunch of stuff, to be honest. He's kind of an interesting guy. One of the things that he mentions relating to the Bible is that he says that the Bible, the original Bible, before it was corrupted, it doesn't support belief in the Holy Trinity. This whole, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And what he did is he went to go find some old texts, the oldest versions of various books of the New Testament. And he said, look, if you go to the really old ones, you don't find this certain comma. And then later on, someone seems to have added a comma, and that comma changes the meaning of this text to support belief in the Trinity. But it was added, and that means we shouldn't believe in the Trinity. What most of us read is this text with a comma, and that's a corruption of the original text. Now, if you want to get into this whole controversy, look up the Johannine comma, or just Isaac Newton and the Holy Trinity, and that's a fun rabbit hole to spend a couple of hours on. But yeah, basically questioning whether the Bible is accurate or not, whether it was accurately transcribed, and whether what people believe now is a result of bad translations of the Bible. Interesting. One more person here, Herman Samuel Reimarus. I don't think that I pronounced that correctly, but in any case, he used mathematics to show that the physical numbers of Exodus are simply not possible. So in the book of Exodus, you have the Jews escaping from Egypt, and you get all this, the full story, right? You get this number of Jews left Egypt at this time, and they, left or they crossed this amount of land, and et cetera, right? Well, Reimarus said none of that is even remotely possible. Like, this number of people can't move this far in this amount of time. And so he is questioning the veracity of the Bible. This is pretty serious, right? And this was not really the norm in the Middle Ages. This is something that's new. It's a new sort of intellectual environment where this is allowed. Now, there's a bunch of things that I'm not even covering, right? I just want you to know a couple of the highlights that I like. I'll give you one more that, kind of shows the intellectual climate here, because it comes from Reimarus again. Reimarus and others pointed out that several of the patriarchs that we see in the Bible, including Abraham and Jacob and David, they were extremely cruel. They were just not good people, it seems like. And what Reimarus said is that, look, I know enlightened secular people, in other words, non-religious people, that are clearly better than these people in the Bible. And so that's a little perplexing and troublesome, right? If you meet a religious person that's basically indistinguishable from an atheist, well, that's a problem, right? But if you're saying, no, I actually know atheists that are better than these religious people, that is really starting to say something, right? So in any case, this is the environment, the intellectual milieu that sort of allowed certain people to enter the scene and, over some time, openly declare themselves as atheists. And so we have some of the first modern atheists popping up. Again, it's a minority. Most enlighteners, I feel, were deists, right? That's sort of like the number one approach to religion by these enlighteners. But there were some that went into full-blown, it's called materialism. That's when you deny the existence of the soul. And atheism, of course, you deny the existence of God. Two people that I'll mention now are Jean Meslier and Baron Holbach. Meslier is a very interesting character because he was actually a French priest who, when he died, they found a book that he wrote where he promoted materialism and atheism. And so that's interesting. But again, he was dead when that book was discovered, so he didn't suffer any negative setbacks. As far as I know. Baron Holbach, though, was alive when he was promoting his atheism. And, he's calling the Trinity a logical contradiction. He's saying that this idea of a incorporeal father, a non-physical God, is an absolute absurdity. And so I want you to know that this is the scene that we're in now. Now, most people are still fairly polite, and, they're not attacking religion very openly, but we do get some, and we will eventually cover an atheistic argument against God's existence. But let's consider for a second what it must have been like to be in this space. You have, on the one hand, some people arguing that we need God for knowledge, right? On the other, you have people that are finally saying, I don't believe in any of this. And then you have people in between who say, well, there is a God, but he doesn't care about you. What do you believe? What should you believe? And how do you arrive at a conclusion? You got so many options here. And to be honest, you can kind of think of yourself as, making maybe the most important decision of your existence. If you bet on the wrong belief, then you might get eternal damnation, right? And so you are like in a gigantic metaphysical roulette wheel. And the question is, what do you bet on? Do you bet on God? Or do you bet against?